we are again with Extreme Makeover Nehemiah Edition. Are we having fun yet? Let me see your hands. Are we having fun with Nehemiah? Tom and I are having fun with Nehemiah. Well, this week's episode is entitled, "The Struggle is Real." My kids use this term, and it's intended to be an ironic reflection on a first world problem. Like one Harvard student saying to another, "I had to walk to class today because my bike got a flat tire." Oh, dude, that must have been impossible. Yeah, the struggle is real. But the struggle was real for the Israelite people whose temple and lives had been destroyed by the Babylonians and who had been in exile for generations. And here in this text, about 50 years later, the struggle was real for the people of Jerusalem as they tried to put things back together. As we just heard in that beautifully done reading for today, the struggle was real for Nehemiah and his construction crew. Sanballat was a Samaritan governor and Tobiah an Ammonite leader. Both were cultural and political rivals of Nehemiah, the Jews, and they were determined to oppose Nehemiah and the work of the people of God, the work that they were doing. And we hear throughout this chapter the lengths to which they go to sow discord, organize others to their side and against the work, and fight to keep the rebuilding from happening. There was ridicule and insult and intimidation and mockery and physical threat and scheming together out in the parking lot to make war and stirring up confusion among the people doing the work. Well, in this very same way, beloved, the struggle is real for Black, Indigenous, and people of color in our country. Cultural and political forces, policy-driven forces, many forces organize, fight, exist to resist, and work to intimidate, oppress, and ensure that the movement for Black lives is misrepresented, resisted, defamed, literally embattled in the streets by military and law enforcement and more, all in an effort to ensure that the movement to rebuild Black lives is not successful. And that's why we chose this series, to find spiritual guidance for our own work to become an anti-racist community. The struggle is real. Now, we might use this struggle is real meme ironically while considering the work to become anti-racist as first world folk who have the privilege of being white. But certainly coming to terms with our individual and corporate white fragility, seeing the truth about the power of white supremacy, and finding the courage to shift the center of that power through policy change, and confessing and making amends for the impact of the systemic racism formed by racist policy. This will be a struggle for us. We've talked about this for the last several weeks. And now that I've said all of that, I think we need to stay away from the meme. It's hard for us to say the struggle is real unironically, because the greatest challenge to this work is our privilege. Those of us who look like me easily fall prey to the spiritual opposition that comes from within ourselves and the organized opposition that comes from outside of ourselves. We'll fall back into denial. We'll turn our attention away. We'll decide that it's too hard or too emotional or too sad or just too much and give up doing the work. And we're able to do that because the policies don't hurt us, because we are considered the culture's norm, because we walk through life not being affected by our race, except for the fact that we're afforded all these privileges that come from whiteness. Let me say it again, for this is what I want us to talk about today. The greatest challenge, our greatest vulnerability to making a difference, the greatest opposition to our becoming anti-racist is our own spiritual condition and the ego-soothing privilege that we hold. For that ego will seek to oppose the change. So let's take a moment to join Nehemiah again, who's facing some pretty strong opposition. As he has for several weeks, Nehemiah shows us a way through. Throughout this story, we've seen courage and triumph in the face of tremendous challenges. Remember that Nehemiah was not a religious professional leader of the prophetic age, but a lay person, one of great faith, who responded with decisive action when he felt the call to guide and lead his people out of physical and moral laxity. And his work really parallels the justice-seeking, action-oriented work that we know that we need to do. So under his direction, the walls of Jerusalem are being rebuilt, restoring physical security to the city's populace. But we will come to see as the book progresses that Nehemiah, along with his partner Ezra, also helped restore the moral fiber of the community. They insisted that the division between rich and poor be diminished. They forbade the land-grabbing, freedom-robbing practices of the wealthy that put the poor into slavery and the community into disarray. And in rebuilding the city walls, Nehemiah helped to once again cement the bonds of community that made everyone responsible to and for one another. You hear that one? Nehemiah partnered with Ezra, who was the establishment, the officially recognized religious leader of those days, and working alongside of Nehemiah, Ezra added another message to the reforming and rebuilding activities. Ezra reminded the people of both the responsibilities demanded by God's commandments, you know this one, love God, love your neighbor, and the joy and hope that is sustained by God's promise of loving us and being with us no matter what. So Nehemiah's political and practical actions, teamed with Ezra's prophetic words of love and concern, brought spiritual and physical renewal to a discouraged and disheartened people. Even though Nehemiah had the king's blessing and the people were eager to rebuild the walls, opposition from others sought to dishearten them from accomplishing the work of God. And once again, we can look at the details of this chapter 4 and find guidance for our own journey to become anti-racist, for there are powerful forces that scheme against that goal. Nehemiah shows us that we can overcome those forces. You could call them adversaries of change, adversaries of equity, even adversaries of love. Like Nehemiah, we can overcome resistance from within and from without. We can overcome the spiritual negativity, we might even call it evil, by following Nehemiah's lead in the 4 things that he does in this chapter. First, by praying. Now, dude, this is Nehemiah's superpower. We have talked about it for 4 weeks now. In all things, at every turn, he sends God in first. And that gives him the capacity to do the hard stuff, including the spiritual practice that strengthen us for work. We've talked about these things: confession, transformation, listening for the will of God in these matters, seeking forgiveness, finding courage. Prayer gives us what we need to do those action steps. Sending God in first gives us the spiritual power to do the right thing. Second, Nehemiah is watchful. Like him, we need to invest in this thing, pay attention to what's going on, and not let our guard down. And we need to see the places, be watchful for the places where the opposition is working against the very thing that we seek to transform. So pray and be watchful. Third, we follow Nehemiah's lead by guarding the places where we are the most vulnerable. There are 1,000 examples of this for us white folks, like understanding white fragility and naming it when you have an experience of it, owning your very own resistance to change, being aware of the ways that white supremacy and systems will act out to keep the power shift from happening. And this is a big one for me, watching out for our inclination to want to please others and make things nice. So not having any upsets at the dinner table or with our friends at the social event, or, oh my God, we are stressing out on social media because we have a difference of opinion, right? So not being able to name the racism that we see for fear of offending someone or making excuses. We make excuses for white people all the time in order to smooth over discomfort and resistance and our friends, right? We're people pleasers. And lastly, the fourth thing, Nehemiah showed us that we have to fight for one another. He was very concerned that since the people were so spread out around the city doing the wall, they were next to each other, as Tom taught us last week, around the city building the wall, but they were spread out. And he was concerned about how vulnerable they were to as they were separated. And therefore, anyone sounding a trumpet would say, come and help me, come and help me fight. We too must learn to fight for one another. When a sibling is in trouble and signals they need help in their spiritual or political battle, we must rally together and come to their aid, fighting for them through prayer, encouragement, and literally being with them. This is the nature of allyship that we will learn how to do over the next little while. And beloved, this is the work that Jesus sent us out to do, to be of use, to serve, to care for those in need, to work for justice for all, and to make equity and love of neighbor our ground, our foundation. And that means we have to put our own fragility aside and be brave for ourselves and for others. And so, dear ones, as we seek to do this work, to be God's agents of change on this earth, we too will face opposition. Even though many times that opposition will manifest itself through, oh my goodness, through circumstances and other people, we must remind ourselves that the most real and devious opposition that we face is spiritual, and it lies within us. As St. Paul reminds us, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, and against the powers of darkness, and against the spiritual forces of evil. When we're faced with an enormous task, but feel pinned down by chronic critics, remember Nehemiah, whose attitude is best summarized by these inspiring words of Teddy Roosevelt. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the one who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, and we will err, and comes up short again and again, because there's no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows the greatest enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends oneself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that one's place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. And so, beloved, I want to invite us into some conversation. It is 11:02, so I'm going to say Bailey's in the back helping us with breakout rooms. We are going to break into 3 breakout rooms. And the question for your breakout room is this. As you see yourself becoming an anti-racist and an ally to the movement for Black lives, Where do you experience yourself most vulnerable to opposition? So where are those places where you feel vulnerable to keeping on when we talk about becoming anti-racist? Bailey's going to put us in. They're dropping like flies, I see. Bailey's going to put us into some breakout rooms. We'll have 3 breakout rooms, and I'm hoping that Stephanie and Paul will partner to make sure everybody gets a chance to share in that breakout room, and then Tom and I will lead the other 2. So here we go.